National Chief, we heard last week that the upcoming hearings in Alberta into missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada has been postponed. Were you informed of this decision and your thoughts on the process so far?
Well, they've had regional meetings already. They've held regional meetings in Wendake, in Ottawa, Montreal, Alton, Ontario, Vancouver, and Whitehorse. So they've held some already across Canada. And so the whole point about them, again, postponing them, of course, families are upset. We get that. We want to make sure that things are done in a very effective and efficient way, but it's there to support the families and as well to start that process. And built ultimately is to, when they come up with their conclusions within a couple of years, is to end violence amongst our people.
National Chief, we have to address the fentanyl situation among our First Nations people in Canada. How do we address such a problem with this drug being so deadly?
Again, with fentanyl, there's a crisis. So we've got to look at short-term, medium, long-range strategies. One thing is to make sure that the communities and families are safe, and in some communities they've banned drug pushers. People that they know are selling drugs in their communities. They don't want them there, and so they want to make sure that their communities are safe. With fentanyl being such a crisis, if there are, for example, I know at Burn Church there was one death and some people got hurt again by fentanyl. So there is a whole issue of making sure you get the assessments and the reviews done by government to make sure they know what's in the pill, right? So there's a whole range of strategies that have to be put in place, but ultimately they've got to be done more effectively and efficiently to make sure that the families and the communities are safe and that this crisis is ended.
National Chief of the Assembly of Nations, Perry Bellegarde, joining CFWE. Mr. Bellegarde, let's talk about the latest federal budget. The Federal First Nations Job Fund and other youth employment initiatives were canceled by the current federal government. Taking resources from such a big demographic is adding to the problems our young people are facing on reserves. Is there a replacement project that you're working on or would like to see happen?
Well, basically, when the fastest growing segment of Canada's population is young First Nations men and women. And so you have a human capital pool. And so it's almost like my message is invest in human capital and you get huge returns on investment in the future. So education and skills training, technical vocational skills training. So one of the main vehicles that they have is the ASSETS program, the Aboriginal Skills and Employment Training Program through, it used to be a Human Resource Development Canada, but now it's CEIC. That they've changed the name so many times. But through that department that's responsible for the ASSETS program, they need to keep making sure that there's support for that program going forward, and as well through INAC, the Post-Secondary Student Support Program. So education and training is the best way out of poverty. And if governments start making those investments, not only federal government, but provincial governments as well, you're going to have huge returns on those investments for education and training. And so the ASSETS program through ESDC, that's the department, and then the Post-Secondary Student Support Program through INAC, and which is, again, we've had 10,000 students on the wait list for post-secondary. We lobbied and advocated hard for investments in PSSP, so that's why the $90 million is there over 2 years, and that's going to go a long way to alleviating some of the stresses and strain on the Post-Secondary Student Support Program.
National Chief Bellegarde, what's your current relationship like right now with the Prime Minister of Canada?
Well, we advocated for, through our Closing the Gap document, our policy and strategy document, to all parties before the October 19th election. And right now, we believe the Liberal government is listening to us because they've talked about closing the gap. They've talked about making investments in education and water and housing and infrastructure. So the Liberal government appears to be listening, but we've got such a long way to go that you're not going to close the socioeconomic gap in 1 or 2 fiscal years. You need 5, 10, 15 years of continual investment in education and training and water and housing to close that 6th versus 63rd gap that I continually talk about. And the gap is basically Canada is rated 6th according to the United Nations Human Development Index, but when you apply the indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. So that 6th versus 63rd should not be maintained, and that's why you need continual investments to make sure that gap is closed. And from the Assembly of First Nations perspective, we can't rest until that gap is closed. So we're thankful that it's moving in the right direction from last year's investment of $8.4 billion and then this year's investment of $3.4 billion dealing with Indigenous issues. It's a movement and a step in the right direction, But again, the gap is so huge, it needs long-term sustainable investments to make sure that gap closes.
The suicide problems in our Indigenous communities are still increasingly growing, especially with the young people on reserves. How are you working with the federal government on this?
You need mental health. We have a good working relationship with Minister Jane Philpott, and she wants to start looking and working towards the whole national mental health wellness strategy, working in partnership, which is key. We need to look at immediate solutions to make sure that there's teams on the ground when these crisis hits our communities. Something short term that to address the immediate crisis, but medium and long range as well. In terms that's the longer pace in terms of that wellness mental health strategy that has to happen, because it's one suicide is too many amongst our communities. So we see the high, we're 5 to 7 times the national average is the youth suicide rate amongst Indigenous peoples. And again, we know that's not acceptable. So we have to work in partnership with First Nations governments and families at the community level, with provincial and federal governments, to address this huge need. And we have a good rapport with Minister Philpott, and we want to make sure that those resources are put in place to end this epidemic amongst our people and get that wellness and that pride back amongst our young people, because we still feel the intergenerational effects of residential schools and colonization. And it's all about getting back to the land, getting the languages, seeing hope, having inspiration, because these lives are so precious and everybody's important. And the Creator, I've always said, doesn't make junk. So everybody's special, and they are loved, and they deserve to be loved.
National Chief Perry Bellegarde joining CFWE. Mr. Bellegarde, what's that one thing while you're still in office that you would still like to achieve?
Well, we've lobbied hard for closing the gap in investments in housing and education and water. We want to see the same quality of life as everybody in Canada. But one of the things we're going to start really focusing on, there's 3 things, but the one that comes to mind is a National Indigenous Language Revitalization Act. We have 58 different nations left languages in Canada, and they should be viewed as Canada's national treasures. They're not spoken anywhere else in the world. And so if we can get that achieved before the next federal election, before I'm done office, that's something. We also talked about a new fiscal relationship with the Crown, because we've had a 2% funding cap for 20 years, and that doesn't meet the needs, and it's not based on total population, doesn't even keep up with inflation. So a new fiscal framework with the Crown, and then as well the big one, which is implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there's 3 pieces. The one that seems to be the low-hanging fruit might be the Indigenous Language Revitalization Act, but the other 2 are equally important as well.